Greetings. Tonight on Maldo's Magic, I have the honor of having on the show Bradley Hubbard, who's a member and has been a presiding officer at various Masonic bodies. This is Maldo's Magic. Hey Bradley, how's it going?
Thank you very much for having me. I appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you for coming on the show. I'm very grateful and honored to have you on the show. It means a lot to me that supporting me on this journey, and I want to kind of dive deep into some topics. I had an idea for this episode to be Freemasonry as a spiritual practice, so I thought that could be like our baseline. We could like start the conversation there. So, but you could tell me about yourself. The floor is yours.
I've been involved with Masonry for about 15 years now, going on 16. As you had mentioned, I'm a member and a presiding officer of several Masonic organizations. I'm involved in a lot of things outside of Masonry as well.
Okay.
Not so much related to Freemasonry, but other esoteric pursuits.
Nice.
It's an integral part of my life, a central facet of who I am.
Okay, so all right. So, do you think that Freemasonry is a spiritual practice? Like, is there? Some people might think that Freemasonry isn't. There's no spiritual components to it, or that maybe it's just about making good men better. Right? It's a common thing we hear. That it's maybe about character building, about doing charity work, like in a nutshell, and some fellowship. But I think, from my background in different various esoteric groups prior to me joining Masonry, that Masonry is definitely heavy can be seen as a spiritual practice if you understand where to look and how to go about it. So, what are your thoughts on that?
It certainly can be. It's designed to be. How it's executed, at least in traditionally as well as in modern times, it often misses the mark on that. I would say that there's only a very small fraction of Masonic organizations that are operating in such a way that it could be useful on the spiritual path. I mean, of course it's useful on the path, but in terms of being an actual spiritual practice, which is a pretty loaded term as to what a spiritual practice, what defines or does not define as a spiritual practice. So in short, it certainly can be. Okay. It is designed to be. Okay. But it takes a different approach than is commonly understood in sort of the Masonic pantheon of organizations and those who practice it.
Why do you think that, like you said, it can be a spiritual practice? So then that maybe alludes to that maybe it's not generally a spiritual practice, or maybe it's not generally seen as a spiritual practice. But then I guess let's maybe start by defining like what is a spiritual practice, right? Because when I first started getting into spirituality, I dove down the rabbit hole. I first started with flotation therapy, sensory deprivation. That got me to help to quiet my mind, learn to meditate, learn about crystals, The Secret.
But you mean the book, like Rhonda Byrne?
Yeah, the book, and I watched the movie right after floating. And it was great. Opened my mind up to a different level of understanding at the time, and I think it helped really save my life at that time.
Wow.
Yeah. So because I was living really big in my ego. I was a sales manager at the time, and before that, I was in nightclub industry, so very dark and partying and whatnot, all the time, all about ego, me, and flotation therapy helped me to quiet down the mind, take the ego down a notch, and enable so I could set myself up to be more open-minded to saying I actually don't know a lot of stuff, because there was a lot I didn't know about and I thought I knew. So I started on that, I call it now New Age path, or a basic metaphysical path, I call it, because it helped me out to a point, but then there was a point where I was questing for more. I knew there was more than just like crystals and going to like devotional, like yoga and stuff like that, like the hip stuff is hip now. I knew there was more, and I started going down the path of like the Western way, but more or less the Gnostic path. So like Gnosis, and learning what is that, what's Gnosis, what is the Kabbalah, and believe it or not, I actually was researching a lecture on John Dean Edward Kelly and like alchemy and stuff and Enochian magic, and that's when I heard about the Invisible Order of the Rosicrucians, and that was the first group that I joined because I was so intrigued by it. I heard about Masonry, but I was like, what is this Invisible Order? And I wanted to know more. So for me, really defining a spiritual practice, I feel like it goes in levels. Like there's a basic metaphysical level first, you know, there's of understanding like the alphabet, you know, what different energies are, you know, vibrations, and then from there getting to a meditative practice. And then I think for me is getting involved in a group or order that has been consistently throughout the ages diving deep into this, where they actually created a system that has worked and helped many people to stay focused when researching this. Because I don't know about you, but I've been down many rabbit holes when I first got into this stuff about, I want to say, maybe 9-10 years ago. For me, how long I've been on this path, from, you know, starting with basic metaphysics. So I think we should define spirituality, right? Or is it, can we define it?
You're going in the right direction, certainly. We're discussing, in this particular instance, Freemasonry is a spiritual practice.
Yep.
That is the active end of the spiritual process, and understanding what the aims and what the spiritual process is,
Okay.
which of course begs the question, what is spirituality?
Yeah, right?
So your, I'm not sure if that's a question or more of your statement, involves so many different facets. You also had mentioned, you know, where my path started and, you know, where it came
Yeah.
from. There's a lot to it, but I think it definitely is worth defining spirituality in a very general, broad sense.
Okay.
Because it can be, you know, so many things. And then talking a little bit about the spiritual process, and then the spiritual practice perhaps as a means of reinforcing and developing the spiritual process with the
okay.
ultimate goal of, it's funny, right? You say about spirituality, there is spirituality, and
Yeah.
people say, well, I'm a spiritual person,
Mm-hmm.
a spiritual person. Well, what does that mean? And a lot of times I think that term is just kind of handed out without really a clear understanding of what being a spiritual person means.
Yeah.
In fact, it's often used, in my opinion, as another label. It's just another form of defining one's identity
Okay.
through this new adjective, spiritual. I'm a spiritual person. So if it is a question in that regard, in my opinion, the spirituality or the spiritual process is a turn inward. It's a turn inward that is looking to come to a quiet understanding of what it is or who it is we truly are.
Okay.
And bypassing the external identities, the external labels, that which during the course of your average day come to define us, me, you, and understanding sort of the larger picture at stake. So spirituality and the spiritual process being a means to that end, a means of discovery. What are,
That's weird.
we're good?
We're good,
Yeah.
yeah.
Okay. The spiritual process being how those tools are employed. So you've got, the spiritual practice being how those tools are employed.
Okay.
So the tool set may be part of the spiritual process, but the application thereof is the spiritual practice that you're talking about, that you're discussing. So when you're looking at it through the lens of Freemasonry, for example, whether it's a spiritual practice, well, it's certainly a part of the spiritual process. Whether or not you use those tools effectively, ineffectively, or even bother to find out what those tools are, that would be perhaps a better rubric to determine whether or not it is a spiritual practice.
Okay.
For you and for I and a
Yeah.
number of others, it may very well be. But it certainly doesn't pass that litmus test with how it's being practiced on the broader scope. And then again, what is the object of a spiritual practice? It's probably manifold. It probably can take several of these episodes just to begin to examine that.
Oh, yeah.
But in terms of it being a spiritual process, it certainly goes a very long way to that. It's not necessarily a complete system within itself, but it meets, in my opinion, the hallmarks of what the spiritual process or spiritual practice is.
Now, do you say not complete system in its basic form and in as far as in Blue Lodge? Meaning, in Blue Lodge is just for the the viewers know, is the first 3 degrees in craft masonry. So do you think in its full form in that, and the basic 3 degrees of the craft, and then it reaches that point at higher degrees in the craft, or maybe the craft can only take you to a certain plateau?
That everything within masonry is defined as the 3 degrees of the craft lodge, the blue lodge, however you want to call that, the lodge. You've got the entered apprentice, the fellow craft, and the master mason.
Okay.
And it's universally agreed that the Royal Arch is part of that core of masonry.
Okay.
So when I talk about pure masonry, when we're talking about is masonry part of the spirit, contained within itself, the spiritual process, for me that question only addresses the first 3 degrees. And of course in our particular jurisdiction in New York, in the United States, the Royal Arch is also comprised of other degrees that lead into the Royal Arch.
Okay.
Whereas in other places in the world, the Royal Arch it doesn't have all these sort of like preliminary. You've got the 3 degrees and the Royal Arch.
Oh, I see what you're saying.
It's just more organizational, like how it's structured here. But when we talk about is masonry whatever it is or isn't, we're only really looking at those. Everything else, we talk about higher orders, and we talk about appendant bodies, concordant bodies, all these different terms that are utilized. Those are organizations that are usually populated by Masons. They may have themes from Masonry contained therein.
Okay.
But strictly speaking, it's not Masonry. Masonry are the 3 craft lodge degrees, including the Royal Arch, which in our particular area includes what's called capitular Masonry, which is a series of 4 degrees.
Okay.
But that's the Articles of Union of 1813 in the Grand that formed the United Grand Lodge of England. And I'm very roughly paraphrasing here. It says pure ancient craft masonry is comprised of 3 degrees only: the entered apprentice, the fellow craft, and the master mason degree, including the supreme order, the Holy Royal Arch. So it's called the Masonic paradox. Okay,
so it's pure ancient craft masonry. But I guess it could be safe to say that now, there still is, even in Europe, concordant bodies. There's still, it still could be, craft could be the first 3 Royal Arch, but they still recognize these other concordant bodies. In the United States, we know they recognize Scottish Rite, they recognize the Shrine, Mystic Order of the Veiled Prophets, that's the Grotto, and
there's a huge pantheon of organizations that fall under the
Masonic families, maybe, or auspices,
of the Grand Lodge. So all of these different organizations, including in our jurisdiction, the Royal Arch, are organizationally subservient to the lodge, the Grand Lodge.
Yes.
So, and I'm not trying to make any qualitative statements about these different organizations. I'm simply saying that ultimately their continued existence is permitted by the graces of the Grand Lodge.
Correct. They came to an understanding, really.
Right. So these, and this has been the subject of entire volumes and textual debates, and not just recently. This is something that has been in question for almost since the inception of Freemasonry, here and in Europe as well. We call these Masonic bodies, well, why? They're populated by Freemasons. Some of the membership may be restricted to Freemasons, but it's not Masonry. It's an opportunity to deepen one's connection with the material. It's an opportunity to share an additional fellowship, perhaps what might be considered affinity fellowships with other brothers, to sort of again deepen that bond and that understanding and that expression of Freemasonry. But Freemasonry is,
of course,
the 3 degrees and the Royal Arch. All the other stuff, and I don't wish that is the case, but if it all disappeared tomorrow, you still have Freemasonry in its core. All these other ancillary
because you can't just so the viewers know, you can't be in any concordant body or different bodies in the Masonic family on the auspices of the 3 degrees and Royal Arch of the craft masonry, unless you're a craft mason. So what he's saying is true, because all these other bodies, if they didn't exist, it would be still masonry, because they only exist and you can only be in them as long you become a Master Mason in craft masonry. You don't have to become a York Rite Mason to be in other concordant bodies, but the York Rite which contains the Royal Arch as a 7th degree is part of craft masonry.
It is worth noting that there are many bodies that organizations, if you will. There are many of them that being a Royal Arch Mason is a prerequisite to join.
Okay, yeah, okay.
So, for the most part, of course, there are other organizations.
But those bodies aren't necessarily considered craft masonry.
They're not. They're not masonry. Yeah. They are bodies that are, and this is all very. You have to understand. Your viewership may be very divided. Those who are familiar with Freemasonry are very divided on that topic. And there, again, if you look into the publications related thereto, as a member of other Masonic organizations or organizations that contain Masons, I would be the first one to admit that to my brothers in those organizations too. What we're doing is not Masonry. It's based on Masonry, but it's a deepening of that fellowship, that bond. It's a deepening of the understanding and the practice of the material of Masonry.
Okay.
But the problem is, and I know we're going down a different tangent than
it's all right. Yeah.
One of the issues with that is that it becomes a distraction. People see that as Masonry, and they take a particular interest in whatever it may be. It could be the shrine, it could be the Knights Templar, and they make that connection with that particular body, and they put their energy and their focus into it at the expense of their proper Masonic experience, which happens in the lodge and in this case the chapter. And that's a danger. It's sort of not seeing the forest for the trees, because all these other organizations are bringing in, and to a degree Masonry suffers from that, it's bringing outside interests into a Masonic setting for these affinity type groups. Again, we mentioned Knights Templar as a great example. That is a predominantly Christian organization. The requirements to get in aren't quite as explicit that you have to be a Christian, but it's very obvious that it would be off-putting to one who is not, into joining that freely. So that is a Christian fellowship affinity organization composed of Masons based on Masonic principles, or the core of Masonry. But ultimately, the organization itself ends there with its connection to Masonry. The fact that it's not universal in its acceptance. If simply all you were doing was replacing the allegory of the lodge and the chapter with now a more fast forwarding, so to say, with a more
I think it's continuing the story. Now, just to kind of stay a little bit on topic, is it all right? So is it? It's okay. Is it safe to say that brothers, or Masons might seek other groups because they're unaware that craft masonry is a spiritual practice? Could that be a safe assumption? That maybe, so I think even throughout history, if you study a lot of the different orders, I'm in the Martinist order too as well, as Elu groups back in the 1700s, around the same time as 1717, when some of the first bodies were coming together, right, where they were becoming public. There has always been there was a craft, but there was only 2 degrees, I believe, and then you had to be prerequisite was a Mason, probably a fellow craft at the time, or a master, maybe of a lodge, what made you kind of a master Mason. Then you could take these on these other higher grades. So that was what I wanted to roll to the next step. But is it because craft masonry since inception has been overlooked as a spiritual practice, where it caused, even around the time, this talking about a couple of decades after 1717, when the Elu Cohens came on the scene, and when the Bavarian group, the Illuminati, came on the scene too as well. Is it safe to say that a lot of those groups started because maybe a lot of them, they were seeking more of a spiritual practice? They were seeking more, I think, of an occult practice, or something more esoteric. When I think of esoteric, I think of studying alchemy. I think of studying Kabbalah. I think of studying, some Enochian magic, or studying stuff that could be considered the occult, the hidden stuff. And maybe because craft masonry maybe really isn't that, so it's heavily veiled in it, where you have to really dig deep to try to find it. Is that why it gets overlooked as a spiritual practice because people come in there and they don't really find that, or that they don't they don't allude to it, or it's not explicit.
Right.
So is that maybe throughout history, I'm seeing a pattern that maybe that's why all these other extra groups are created. You have the strict observance after the Elo Cohen kind of split apart. That was by Jean-Baptiste Willimos. I know he spearheaded that organization. You have a couple other different organizations that developed into the Scottish Rite, and was that because that maybe craft masonry doesn't do a good enough job at being explicit with what this really is? Like it's left interpretation. That's what I've seen from my experience, where it's not as explicit. Like if you join a Rosicrucian order or something, I know we're a little off topic, but it's more explicit as like you're diving into spiritual practices where like it's not, you don't have to like, you don't have to allude to it, or it's not veiled, an allegory. And we could use allegories, but it's direct. We're trying to learn telepathy, we're trying to do meditation, we're trying to do astral projection. It's very explicit what we're trying to do, and those could be seen as spiritual practices. So is that why maybe craft masonry gets overlooked throughout the ages, and even now today, where it may be the reason why these other groups were created? Not every group, because not every concordant body is esoteric, but maybe created too, because maybe some people overlook the fact that craft masonry is a spiritual practice, and maybe they don't do a good enough job to explain that. Maybe they just think it's just the ritual, it's just the initiation. Obviously, we know it's transmission, and not explicitly saying it's a spiritual practice. So maybe that's why brothers might seek other bodies. What are your thoughts?
I'm staring down the barrel of a shotgun of questions, maybe double barrel here. That was a lot in that. So let me first say that I can't speak to the origin of these groups because I just don't have the breadth of knowledge on it.
It's okay.
But certainly even some of the modern groups that I am acquainted with, why they were formed, what the motivations were, I really can't say. However, what I will say is that it's absolutely being missed, the spiritual practice aspect of craft masonry.
Okay.
It's not well understood. It likely was never well understood, at least universally among Masons. Talk about the density of the allegory, what was at one point necessary due to geopolitical situations surrounding Masons at the time of its inception. I mean, when Masonry was being formed in the 17th century, I mean, people were still being, burned at the stake for this sort of thing, for these types of practices. So, and even throughout history, I mean, during World War II, if you look at Masonry in Europe and how deep underground that it had to go, there have been various points in Masonic history, particularly in its inception, where the security afforded by the allegory, the density of the veiling, was necessary. So that's not necessary anymore, at least in our context. Nobody's coming to knock down our doors with pitchforks and torches at the moment. Society does change rather rapidly in those regards, but at the moment that's not an issue. So the density of the allegory is not necessarily as vital as it was, practically speaking, at those times. The allegory is also such, the density of the veiling of the material is such that it requires you to have sustained study in order to start to unveil it. And I can tell you throughout my own personal Masonic journey, reading texts 15 years ago, which really didn't seem like it had much bearing on my path, and reading them 10 years ago, 5 years ago, and then today, I might as well be reading completely different books. That's how you know if it's really that well written. The book will evolve with your ability to understand it.
Okay.
And in so many ways, that's what craft masonry does. It evolves with your ability to understand it as you diligently put it into practice and come to a deeper understanding. So it evolves with you, and that's how you know that it really does have the germ of a spiritual process, because it's not static. It evolves along with the practitioner. I also want to clarify with regards to spiritual practice, we're almost speaking about it as if it's a list of things. If you do A, B, C, and D, then this sort of thing will happen out of it. a true spiritual practice, a true spiritual process, everything becomes a spiritual practice. Driving in your vehicle, in your car, becomes a spiritual practice. What you eat and what you drink, how you eat and how you drink, how you approach almost every facet of your life.
Spiritual practice is like the way can be connected to the way you live. Everything you do is spiritual practice, but a spiritual process is really what Masonry is, or really what these groups are that we're kind of touching on. They're a spiritual process. I'm not saying every concordant body. I'm just saying it's safe to say that Masonry can be seen as more of a spiritual process. But yet we're doing activities there, like talking there. So basically we're still doing a spiritual practice as well, but it could be, the work could be a process. Is that where I'm getting?
Everything is, what I'm specifically alluding to is the fact that a spiritual practice is not any one thing that you do. It's not, okay, I'm doing this ritual in this particular setting, and I'm invoking this or cleansing that, whatever the case is. That is a spiritual practice. But when we talk about a spiritual practice, I have a certain routine that I go through daily as part of my process, and those practices are reasonably well fixed, and I do this first, and I do this second, and I do this third, with whatever goals I have in mind with it. However, with Masonry or any other spiritual process, something that's intended to be a spiritual process, everything becomes a spiritual practice. If you want to look at Freemasonry in particular, there are guidelines on how one should communicate with the world, how one should communicate with his brother Mason, the stranger on the street, and really they're no different. We speak with respect and understanding and compassion, all of these tenets that are inculcated by Freemasonry. It's not something you do when you go to the lodge, it's something you do throughout your entire life, and all of the lessons are giving you what Freemasonry calls the working tools, and how to apply them in every situation. So, temperance and avoiding excess, subduing your passions, all of these different things. Some of them are very generalized, but if you want to look, and maybe I'm making a little bit of a strained analogy, but in Eastern forms that might be called yama and niyama, right word and right thought. And that's one aspect of a spiritual practice that tends to be universal. How you think, how you speak, how you act. It shouldn't be how I speak with you, and what I'm talking about here is
yes, I think, go on.
So the idea, basically, to sum that up, is that the spiritual practice is not any one given thing. It's not limited to a particular location, a lodge, a temple, whatever it is. It's what you bring out into the world. Because I knew people in the course of my life that did outrageous things Monday through Saturday, outrageous things. But Sunday morning, they'd always be in church. And the person that went to church was a completely different person than how they acted the rest of the week. That is missing the mark. If you only do Masonry or employ those practices, if you will, when you're at the lodge, and not doing them elsewhere, then it is absolutely not a spiritual practice. It's not a spiritual process. It's really nothing. It's a social outlet that, for whatever reason, people do those things. So I don't strictly define it.
Could be seen as more like, I think psychologically, sometimes we're used to patterns. So most of us, some not, but some of us, grew up going to church. So, it was a pattern, and maybe, my parents grew up going to church and their parents grew up in church, right? Our parents maybe, and that's why they took us to church, because it was just something that you do, because there's always a part of healthy society has always, even throughout the ages in the Roman times, to fast forward to the Christendom, has been having a spiritual practice, or maybe a religious aspect of it, where there's a temple where they understand reverence to deity, but even still, then maybe now after, they might be throughout the week, some of them not always living up to the tenets, right? But I think it's been a pattern where everyone's been used to doing that and going to where they take their kids and keep going. But it doesn't mean, just because people go to lodges or different organizations, it doesn't mean that they will maybe practice what they preach, or maybe they understand that you need to take this out into the world. But even the scriptures say it.
It's literally the closing charge in a lodge. Take this out into the world. It's meant to pass that threshold, because a true spiritual process lives within you, because the process is within you. I'm not saying that I'm evolved to the point where I can do this. I'm a flawed individual just like everyone else. You know, I have lapses more frequently than I would care for, but you do make that attempt. And that's what Masonry is trying to do. It's trying to encourage its constituency to make that attempt, to always strive for excellence, not just in material pursuits, but also in how you think and how you act. And in that sense, the Masonic spiritual process shares common ground with so many others. And I don't know enough of them that I can say universally. I'm sure there are divergences. But I mean, when you look at elements of yoga as a spiritual process, not as I call it, like the strip mall stretch and fart yoga.
Yeah.
It's proper yoga as in its original form.
But maybe to some people, like, I think the problem with spirituality is, and thank you for explaining it that way too, is that I think, you know, that people might think that, you know, the strip mall yoga or doing all that, they might think it's maybe a step in oh, I'm doing yoga now, so and like they feel more spiritual now.
Sure.
Because but feeling more spiritual and being spiritual are two different things, right?
Very different things.
Yeah.
One is just another. It's just another tag of identification. That's a very good, a valid analogy to make. Hey, look, there might be several strip mall yoga places. They're all probably doing great things. Some of them maybe just bringing money, whatever the case is. But if you are doing it as an exercise, then what you've gained is an exercise, physical exercise. If you do it as a spiritual process, then you need to align yourself with an organization, if it's yoga that we're talking about, that has that complete package. Okay. Otherwise, it's just an exercise. It's something you do on a whatever night of the week, a couple of times a week, to stretch and feel better in your bodies. That's great as an exercise, but it's not a spiritual process. Masonry, if you're just going to the lodge to socialize, have a couple of cheap drinks and fellowship and stuff like that, and then you go and it's done, that's just a social event. It's a social occasion. It's not Masonry. So I also am a bit more of a fundamentalist. I have a lot more rigid view, if you will, and I that's kind of a weird term to use when we're talking about spirituality, but I mean, I definitely draw a clear line. Consciously I do this. I'm aware that I'm making this line between what I consider to be Masonry and what I consider to not be Masonry, and I don't have a specific percentile that I apply, but I would have to say that it's probably about 95% of Masonry out there is not, in my opinion, Masonry. It's just something people are doing, and the only thing that carries it through under the guise of Masonry is that they are hopefully performing a set ritual, and they're doing it as well as they can, hopefully proficiently. But that is the vehicle in which the spiritual process is transmitted from generation to generation in as much intact as possible, because you may have a lodge that was not doing Masonry previously, but the ritual is intact, and now the new brothers who are involved in that lodge are doing it. So it was transmitted intact generationally through the ritual. That's why
that makes sense.
Masonry puts the ritual above everything, because that's where it's being conveyed.
All right, great. So I think that's a great segue into the next topic. I wanted to talk about what is OM Masonry or TO Masonry. And before I let you explain that, I see OM compared to, as a Martist, we follow something called the ancient observance. So, and it's interesting because in Martinism, how we open our lodge, and Martinism, if you understand the history of it, basically, just for the viewers that don't know, back in the mid 1700s in France, there was a Mason named Martinus de Pasquale. His father had a patent from the Bonnie Prince Charlie to actually open up lodges. That was passed down to him to open up lodges. So that's why you get the connection with Scottish Rite, but in inception being in France. So he was said to be a Spaniard, went to France, and he was a Master Mason at a lodge there, and then he basically formed a group called the Elu Cohen, and the Elu Cohen was a group that was meant for Master Masons. A lot of it had to do with military lodges too, as well. He was in the military, and that wanted to go deeper into Masonry and as more or less like a spiritual practice, whereas they were like basically Elu Cohen means in French the elect priests. So they were priests that were trying to reintegrate themselves. That's the whole thing is about reintegration, reintegrating yourself. You know, with obviously he sees us as you know, Adam fell. He saw it in a kind of a Kabbalistic twist. He has a great book, Reintegration of Beings, and he talks about like the story of Adam and stuff. But basically, that is where today's Martinism comes from. You know, the line from Pappus in the 1800s, right before World War I, so late 1800s to 1900s, he revitalized that because he got initiated. So it was like a chain of lineage from that. But basically, how Martinist lodges opened in the ancient observant model. So, which is I find similar to the OM model. That's why I wanted to just kind of preface it before by explaining that to you, because within that model we do have a procession. You know, it is open a certain way always, and that's what I was talking to one of the brothers a couple of days ago about, how with Masonry and the OM and what we're trying to do with it, and how in some other groups it's the strictness or the observance part or the traditional observance or the ancient observance. I think that it's all trying to do the same thing. These are brothers, Martinists, Masons that are maybe fundamentalists or traditionalists. But I like it because in Martinism it's always open that way. Like, so every lodge is like that. There is no, you know, designation as an OM. They all have to be open in the ancient observant model. So I thought that was interesting to segue into maybe you explaining to the viewers what OM or TO stands for and how we can kind of connect things. I like to, my background is I joined a lot of these groups prior. The Masonry was the last thing I joined, so that's like where the background. It's old. People always say it's reverse, you know. Yeah. But and so when I look at Masonry, I see, oh, that's just something that we do in this group. Always, that's just how we. There is no, you know, no lodge has to get an OM Martinist lodge, you know, or because the group in particular, Martinism, Elu Cohen, you know, some of them lead to like Knights Templar form of Martinism as well. It's all, they're all like that. There is no lodge that is in question if they're observing the craft or observing their craft.
Once again, this is a shotgun approach to asking a question. Yeah. So let's start with the simplest aspect. OM, TO. TO stands for, it's an acronym for Traditional Observance. Okay. OM is for Observant Masonry, also synonymous with Masonic Observance. Before even getting into parsing out the definitions and why there's these two terminologies for it, I think it bears mentioning that what you're describing in the Martinist order that you're familiar with, the tradition that you're familiar with, it's not different than a lodge, right? Every lodge is required to open the lodge in a certain way. Correct. Right. That doesn't change with observant Masonry or traditional observance, however you want to phrase it. We'll talk about that in a second. Okay. But we're all prescribed to do that. It's maybe varying degrees of proficiency in doing that. Maybe some lodges are doing it, they're memorizing the work better, whatever the case is. But observant Masonry doesn't prescribe that a lodge be opened the same way. Masonry prescribes that a lodge is opened in a certain way. So the universality of that opening, it's by jurisdiction, right? And we're in New York. So under our jurisdiction, there is a very set ritual for the opening of the lodge. You can't change that. You can't add things to it because you think it would sound better a certain way. You can't take things away from it either. So in its baseline, in absence of a conversation about observant Masonry or traditional observance, Masonry already has that. We're told to do it in exactly this way, by the book, so to say. Oh, so, okay. All right, I mean, every lodge in New York State is supposed to open the exact same way. Okay, but it's safe to say, when someone comes, you know, obviously the only OM Masonic Lodge I've been a part of is the one we're both a part of is Alsani Lodge in Northport, right? Is that it's, to me, it's
it's open differently in a way, not open differently, but there's things that are done prior to the actual open of the lodge, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
But what I was trying to say is that those are things that are always done in, like, say, a Martinish lodge, where a procession of officers, where you don't see that in every Masonic lodge.
Right, because it's not part of the ritual. The
Okay.
ritual is very specific. Now, if the ritual said, "Hey, do these things as well," then it would be done in every lodge, or
Okay.
technically should be done in every
Okay.
lodge. So it's important. We haven't even gotten into the definition or the distinguishing factors, but before we do, it's very important to understand that anything in Masonic terms, because I'm not sure your viewership, how versed they are in certain terms, your Masons are probably already got this, who are watching, probably already have this in their mind. Innovation. Innovation is anything that you add to the ritual that's not supposed to be there.
Okay.
Or change. Let's say change.
Yeah,
Sometimes
okay.
it's not adding, it's just moving things around.
Okay.
That's called innovation in Masonry, and it's prohibited. It's a no-no. So when we talk about what an observant lodge does versus a non-observant lodge, there's no innovation occurring.
Okay.
The ritual is the ritual. If
Okay.
something happens before it,
Okay.
as long as from start to finish the ritualistic section is intact, that which is done before or afterwards, as long as it's not interfering with the ritual. And I'm not using this as a blanket statement or
Okay.
a blank check to say, hey, you can do anything out there. That's not what we're talking about. These are processes that enhance or deepen the profundity of the ritual itself. And we can get into a few of them.
I have
Some
a good
of them we
I
can.
have a good example too to connect to. All right, so it's safe to say too, like, it could be, you could say it as, when you go to mass, let's just give it in the church setting, right? If you go to mass, not always, but for most of the time in maybe a Catholic mass, there's actually a procession, right? So I like to, some research I've done is that the Masonry is very connected to the church. There's a lot of stuff within Masonry that was done in the church. As much as it's not a religious group or order, it's non-sectarian, whatever. We don't talk about religion and politics in Masonry. This is a magical podcast, so I will talk about it. So there is a procession when you go into a mass, right? So, and the procession, it may be the priests, the deacons, maybe the altar boys. So in a sense, that could be seen. It's not really, maybe it might not be part of it, even though maybe it is part of it because they're very traditionalist. It might not be part of it like in a Protestant church, right? So maybe because it's still, like I said, it's all Christianity, right? They'll still believe in Christ, but they might not have that. They might not do a procession, but we're still reading the same Holy Bible. We're still talking about Jesus in a Protestant church or in a Catholic mass or church, right? But the difference is, and I'm trying to explain to connect to OM, is that you're doing a procession, and then it starts. Then the mass starts. That's not technically part of the mass, but that's, like, I think a part of reverence, and everyone's standing, right, as the officers do in the lodge. The brethren in the lodge are standing, right, and it could be seen as basically, it could be a forgotten art that should or maybe has been done in the past. Hence why we're observing the craft. Where I like to connect it as stuff that my mind takes me to. In the church mass, you do see a procession, and then the actual mass starts. But that's not really the mass. But that's leading to the reverence of. I think it's giving a focal point to something in the church setting, and us too. It's giving the brethren and the officers a focal point of reverence. Saying we are now entering a sacred space.
Absolutely. You're focused on one particular process,
Correct.
a procession.
Yeah.
The military has processions.
Okay. Tell me about that.
So many different. Processions are not necessarily limited to one denomination or religious. Processions are universal. There's something very at a base human level about processing, and all a procession does, without getting into a separate conversation on that, is it prepares the space.
Okay, I like that. Okay.
There's a lot to that, and we could talk about several different.
We might get into that further in future episodes, or further tonight, depending on how late.
Because this happens elsewhere. It happens in just a lot of different places. So procession is one tool that's employed. But when we talk about an observant lodge versus a non-observant lodges, non-observant lodges by the book, I've seen processions elsewhere.
Okay.
In a lodge.
I have too, actually.
Doesn't make them observant.
Correct. Okay.
But it's certainly one of the elements that are employed by observant lodges. I would love to circle back to how you actually began this segment, which is TO versus OM.
Yeah, let's
and
go.
What that is and how, because even Masons who may be watching this podcast may or may not have heard of it. They may have heard information that might or might not be accurate. So traditional observance is a movement that started in Freemasonry and was called such roughly about 30 years ago, is when this particular vein that we're seeing today, called traditional observance. And that was they used the word traditional in the sense of observing what they felt existed in the craft, and for whatever reason disappeared or went out of fashion for use, whatever the case was. About 14 years ago, roughly 15 years ago, this term came up, observant Masonry or Masonic observance. The first, and I'm not necessarily giving credit, but the first time I've ever heard it used was by an author named Andrew Hammer, who wrote a book called Observing the Craft. It's a phenomenal book. I would recommend it to anybody who's even interested in Masonry, and it'll give you a perspective as to not only what observant Masonry is, but why it's necessary, why it's so important, why it's critical, really. Most of what we've discussed in one form or another tonight can be found or referenced in that book. So it's a great
thing
book.
I brought it tonight.
Oh, there you go. Okay, it's right there. So that's where, and very rightfully so, we can look at early Masonry in the 1700s, 1800s, and find out that just because it was done traditionally, it doesn't mean that it was necessarily the highest and best use of the craft. There was absolutely ridiculous side rituals that included, all sorts of ribaldry and lighthearted humor.
That's high degrees, right?
Yeah, all those high degrees. But just because something is traditional, something that was done previously, doesn't necessarily make it right or the best version. So observant Masonry is rightfully applied as an improvement on that term to say we are simply observing Masonry. And what is Masonry? Masonry is pretty well defined as to what it is and what it isn't, and we touched upon that a little bit earlier. So observing it is another way of
hoping
saying,
it goes past again, but so I want you to get cut off.
Oh, okay.
Let's just hope it goes past 20, and then we should be good.
2002. You seem to be okay. All right. So, so observing Masonry is understanding, studying, and ultimately employing the highest and best practices to allow Masonry to deliver its message, allow Masonry to have the impact that it was always intended to have. So observing Masonry is doing exactly that. Now, how that manifests itself. It manifests itself in many different ways. It tends to be particular to the area that you're in, whatever the composition of the brothers that ultimately compose the lodge. It can differ in different areas of the island, of the state, of the country. But ultimately, observant Masonry is an unending quest for excellence in all pursuits, particularly in this case, Masonic pursuits. And what does excellence mean? How can you make it even more profound, even more of a vehicle to deliver that spiritual process, which is what Masonry was always intended to deliver. And all of these practices, you mentioned one which is a procession, the use of incense, the use of music, or sound, I should say, the use of silence, the tactical use of all these things. It's not just, hey, let's play a song, and it's understanding why music, or why sound, why silence, when silence, and directing it accordingly. It requires an incredibly deep and intimate understanding of Masonry, Masonic practice, how to employ it. So the individual practices that are commonly found among observant lodges, it's not like, hey, if you check 8 of these 10, you're probably observant. If you check all 10, you're definitely observant. Masonic observance, most concisely put, is an ethos. It's a concept that is held by a group of Masons who are coming together to practice Masonry. And it's not enough to simply understand or hold that concept. It needs to be actively employed. It needs to be put to use. So observant Masonry can have signals and signs of its manifestation, but ultimately it's an understanding of what that is that will allow you to determine whether a lodge is observant or not observant. It's not as simple as that. A lot of lodges throughout the world, I'm not talking about locally, or I'm not singling anybody out.
Yeah.
There are lodges who call themselves TO lodges or OM lodges, but they probably aren't really fulfilling that mission. And that creates a situation where other Masons come to find out, what is this? The best and easiest way to do it is to go to an observant lodge and find out what that is. If they are not fulfilling that goal as an observant lodge, then whoever's come to ascertain what observance is now comes away with an improper opinion of it. It could be positive, negative, or otherwise. It could just be purely informational. Oh, well, observant Masonry does these things. It may or may not be accurate. So there was an organization, a national organization, that came to certify lodges as observant, so that if another brother from any other jurisdiction came and wanted to understand what is observant Masonry, they can go to this lodge that has been certified and say, well, this is a pretty accurate picture of what it is. And it became necessary because people were just throwing the term about.
Okay.
In New York, for various reasons that are far beyond the topics that we're dealing with, it was determined that our state should have its own internal certification body. It's the Committee on Observant Masonry, so that we do that internally and determine whether, to the best of our ability, we can say a lodge is operating in an observant manner. The idea being, observant Masonry, and this is sort of like one of the biggest jokes in Masonry, tongue-in-cheek, people don't realize that observant Masonry is just Masonry. It's not something beyond, above, below, sideways. It's just Masonry. It's really what all of us should be doing as Masons. But because we've strayed so far from the definition of Masonry in our practice, now we have to say, well, if somebody's doing that as closely as they can, that's now observant. No, it's just Masonry. But we've had to create this designation that separates those who are fulfilling that to the utmost and those who are not. And the idea is that not every lodge should become observant, but there are practices contained within that, on the whole, add to the profundity of Masonic, the Masonic experience, that it would behoove the craft to start adopting.
So could it be safe to say that OM lodges are Masonry? It is Masonry, but it needs to be seen as that, so to light a beacon, so maybe other brothers who are maybe traveling, or they're looking for a more traditional Masonic experience, which is still Masonry, but more just in a more traditional form. Now, is that the best way, or the reason why the designation is there in a way to be like a beacon in a sense for, because I've had some Masons, or people that I referred to Masonry, and I would tell them, hey, if they live in Florida or another state, hey, look up a TO lodge, one lodge. First, so you could see, because I know, people that I know are maybe more on the traditional side of things, they might like a lodge that maybe down south or different areas might not always dress up, or maybe this lodge might be more traditional factor, that always wearing suits or tuxedos, and that's something that fits maybe their personality better. So can it be seen as more as also a beacon to light the way for other brothers that are more traditionally minded, to know that, okay, they know if they go in there, that they know what they're getting, or they know that they're going to be practicing traditional Masonry here, which is still not different from regular Masonry. It's still not anything different, higher, lower. It's just, there's just some more traditional items that are practiced.
I would encourage you, for no other reason than it's a more appropriate term to use, to replace traditional with observant.
Observant, okay.
It's because, again, you can go and say it's more traditional. Traditional to what? What tradition are you looking for? Because Masonic ritual does differ from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. I was in Virginia for almost a decade, and it is different there. It's not so different that it's unrecognizable, but there are differences. So what might be traditionally Masonic in Virginia could differ slightly when it comes to ritual or modes of dress, whatever the case is. So I think that it's just saying observing what Masonry is, observant is really the best term, in my opinion. But I think that knowing you outside of this single podcast, that I think you'd find it as well. So yes, Masons who are looking for a particular type of experience in their Masonic practice, the designation of an observant lodge, or TO lodge if you want to go that way, it does. It's a beacon. It suggests that it'll be an exemplification of what the tenets of Masonry are, the highest and best form of that. So it is a beacon. It's each observant Masonic lodge, the point of it being observant is that it can serve as an exemplar to the craft of Freemasonry, that it can be a sharing of ideas. There are so many wonderful practices that tend to fall under this umbrella of observant Masonry that can be employed in any lodge. As a matter of fact, I've seen it done where people will attend an observant lodge, say, hey, look, we don't really want to wear tuxedos at every meeting, we don't really want, but we like this, we like the incense, we like the procession. So they do that a little bit at a time, and that improves the experience for their lodge. And then somebody will visit them and say, hey, that was an interesting thing that really added to my experience. So it'll proliferate these ideas, but the idea of having a particular lodge being designated as OM is really exclusively for the point that they can serve as an exemplar to others. Whether it's a visiting brother and you're visiting Florida and you want to just attend a lodge, but you know what you want in that lodge, you look up an OM or a TO lodge.
Now, to get a little deeper, because I like to get deeper in my podcast, right? I like to, it's Maldo's Magic's all about, like, when you talk about, like, and let's say, not to go off too off topic, when we talk about, like, Kabbalah, there's something called pardes. So it's like, when you're deciphering, like, text, there's, like, a surface level, there's symbolic level, there's mystical interpretation, then there's the occult, the hidden interpretation. So can it be safe to say that, yes, it's like you touched on it, some lodges might come there, they experience it, they might bring some stuff back, maybe incense, something to maybe make it a better experience. But on a deeper level, could an OM model be something that helps the profane to stay out of the sacred, by doing these things that keep the space sacred and keep the profane, in the place where it's supposed to be at, and doing these things? So, like, when you go to church, it's sacred space. There's incense going, so it's not a place where you're on your phone watching TikTok. Same thing when the Masonic Lodge is. We're not on our phones. We're not supposed to be, right? We're taking it serious. We're entering to a sacred place, or we're entering a holy ground. So is it safe to say that an OM lodge is a lodge that understands that the lodge, the temple, is a sacred space and it should be kept that way, and these items that enhance the experience will also enhance the idea of the understanding that we have to keep this space sacred? So something I just kind of thought of right there, how maybe it is. What do you think about that?
Well, we are going to.
I'm going a little deeper.
Quite a bit deeper down, and it's justified, because everything we've talked to at this point has been more structural. It's really been the superficial elements of what that is. Observant Masonry, I mentioned earlier about the pursuit of excellence, and just to give you a visual, and maybe one that is Masonic related in the sense it involves a stone. When you're trying to separate a block of stone from the larger rock surface, right? You might find just a crack, and you're driving a wedge into it, and you drive that wedge deeper and deeper and deeper until it finally cracks. The pursuit of excellence is finding out, in terms of observant Masonry, it's finding that crack, our entrance point into the spiritual process. And every strike of that wedge is maybe these different practices and processes that tend to be associated with observant Masonry. And it's to drive that wedge deeper and deeper, to fracture this sacred space from the profanity that surrounds it. So observant Masonry is essentially to create, and this is an element of the spiritual process elsewhere, almost universally, you are creating an instance for the practice that you're pursuing, the spiritual practice that you're pursuing. In our case, Masonry is the discussion here. So that instance is created, and it's a crucible where you can really, almost a vacuum of the profane, where it's an entirely sacred space where you can employ those practices to their most effective possibilities that are offered within the craft, so that it's an intensification for the time that lodge is open. Because the lodge people think of is just a building. Oh, that's a Masonic lodge. I have one in my town. A lodge isn't the building, that's the Masonic temple. So the idea of observant Masonry is to create that crucible, that intensification of Freemasonry, so that when the members, and again, I think where we might have gotten cut off in the last segment there, is that people think that a Masonic lodge is a physical edifice. That's a Masonic temple. The Masonic lodge is a group of people, it's Masons, that open an instance, if you will. It has a beginning and an end. The lodge is opened, it performs its function, and then it's closed. And it doesn't exist. It never truly physically exists in that sense. It's a spiritual edifice. But it doesn't exist in between those instances, except in the hearts and consciences of the brethren. So what it is when you open that lodge, you've created this intense energetic situation where you can practice what Freemasonry is supposed to be practiced, and then it's so intense that the mark of it is left on the individual brother, and it should endure out into the profane, protected within, until its next instance, next opening of the lodge. So the point of observant Masonry is to intensify that pursuit of excellence, as I said before, about driving that wedge deeper and deeper. Each of these practices is another tool in your toolbox in order to create that separation between the sacred and the profane, with the intention of creating an incredibly intense energetic situation where you can practice Freemasonry, whatever that is, and then retreat from it and have it essentially etched onto your conscience, in order to your consciousness, in order to carry it throughout the week or two of the profane that you have until the next. So you wanted to go deep, and I think that's a deep.
We could go deeper too. So now, could it be? Thank you for that. So could it be also that? Now we get into a term. Could it be when we open the lodge, right? Not the building, right? When we're opening the lodge, when we're opening the sacred space, like when they're opening a mass, because a mass only lasts a certain time, right? A religious service lasts a certain time,
right? And
then it says, the mass is over. So they send people to go spread what they just learned, or the way I'm understanding on a more like esoteric, or magical way, is that the lodge is a place where you connect with the egregore. So in my understanding, this is just my opinion. So what I'm seeing as, it's a place where you connect to the egregore in like a magical, spiritual sense, and where you do certain ceremonial work, right? Because it is ceremonial, right? You do a ritual. You open up the temple in the form it should be. The lodge, sorry, in the way it should be, and then you. The items you're doing, are helping you to connect to the Masonic egregore, and it could be a way where you're actually helping to charge up or intensify that split, right? That wedge. You're driving that wedge. And what is the wedge? The wedge is what you're doing, but it's also, and the way I understand it could be is you're building up the egregore, because egregore is the one that's also helping that wedge, meaning the collective conscious of the group is what's doing that. So I don't know if you want to touch on the egregore. What do you see about that, or has it any connection to it?
The egregore, you're not only just connecting to it, but you're building it, you're reinforcing it, you're creating it. I mean, every lodge has an origin, and prior to that, the only egregore that exists is the Masonic egregore that you are calling upon when you open a lodge ritualistically according to that ritual. So there is a sense of, I'm fabricating terms.
Can we explain to like the viewers like what an egregore is for those that might not know what egregore is?
Yeah, absolutely. An egregore is, how to best explain this, because this is a very in-depth topic in and of itself.
Yeah, I think maybe a simple form. I mean,
it's an energetic situation. It is, in a sense, an entity, but one has to hesitate to use the term entity because it can be confounded with any number of other spiritual processes that have actual entities that are called upon. But it's a collection of spiritual energy manifested, but it's also a collection of the individual energies that are put into it at that particular instance, the opening, as well as the one that has existed prior to it. Meaning, if you have a lodge that's 150 years old, there potentially can be an egregore that has grown over that time.
And the egregore maybe like it's the name of it, like it could sorry to cut you off. It could be like there's a overarching Masonic egregore, right? Masonry.
It's called upon and sort of borrowed from to create.
And but then now there's the lodge. So is my saying right? Is it temple? So the building, temple, lodge.
Building is the temple. The lodge is the non-physical space.
So the lodge has maybe been participating or having action in a specific temple for over 100 years, right? For where it's connecting to that the inception egregore on a smaller scale, on a micro scale of the greater macrocosm of the macro Freemasonry egregore. Is that kind of safe to say in that?
The egregore can be strengthened, and I don't think we've really provided your viewership a proper definition.
I think a simple way, if I can, a simple way would be too is understanding and I'm not a big sports fan, right? So I always tell people, the people that know me know I'm not big into sports. I read, I meditate, Masonry, and into a lot of other groups and family is very important to me. But if you're into sports, so the Jets have an egregore, so it's a common. Basically, it's a collective consciousness of people that believe in that team, or the Giants, or the Yankees. So they wear, the items that represent that egregore, and there is an entity, there's a spiritual force, whether they know it's spiritual or not, that they're connecting to, that's drawing them to stay active. It keeps them fueling it, and the egregore has to be fueled. The activities in the lodge is what fuels the egregore. So the activities in the stadium is what fuels it. And then when they talk about it after, but then they come back to it, they watch on TV, that those actions are building, or the behaviors are building up that type of egregore, because it is an egregore. Many groups have it. Not saying it's a spiritual egregore, just so the viewers can understand, in a basic term, but in a more spiritual term, an egregore is a spiritual, it's a collective consciousness doing a consistent thing, either in a space or consistent type of ritual under a consistent banner. Like the Catholic Church has their own egregore. Rosicrucian orders have their own egregore. It's a spiritual envelope or umbrella that protects it, but it's also energized by the members as well.
You touched upon one. The Catholic Church has an egregore, but each individual church draws from the greater egregore, yet at the same time has its own. So you'll have a different sort of an egregore by the church, a small church, a big church, one in this country, one in that country. What the physical space looks like can of course influence that as well. The sports analogy might be slightly labored. I see where you're going with it.
You understand? That's how I always explain it to other people. Why? Because some, majority of people, like sports or watch sports. I just don't. I know people that are not even that into it, but still watch it or know it, or they, it's. I feel like, because when you start reading some books on egregores, the egregore can become needy in a sense, because it needs the members to keep doing it, to keep it alive in a sense, right? And when the members, want to keep it alive, right? But there can be egregores that are maybe don't have could come where they kind of take energy away and they ask for too much. So but that's a little along the lines of more like within high magical groups, because like you said, even groups themselves have their own egregores when it might be an order, but the smaller temples within magical orders called temples, they have their own egregore. So like I guess like you're saying, Masonic lodges have their egregore, which feeds from the
greater umbrella of Masonry.
Same thing like the Catholic Church might have their big egregore. I say big because it's I think one of the biggest and oldest egregores that's consistently around, and they're smaller, micro in the local area. The cathedrals or places you could go to have their own egregore, but they feed from that one.
It's a non-physical, energetic entity. It
Perfect.
It can be worked with.
Mm-hmm.
It can be worked against.
Mm-hmm.
It can be created. It can grow. It can shrink. Understanding what the egregore is, tapping into it, connecting with it, can do miraculous things. And we're talking about in the Masonic sense in particular, but understanding that there is an egregore, what the nature of that egregore is, and how to work with it in order to achieve the goals of the group is really what we're looking at in the Masonic sense. And it absolutely is a spiritual energy. I mean, it's something that's not you, it's not me. In a sense, it's us, but it's much even bigger than that. So it's difficult to really pin it down. There are obviously dictionary definitions. Yeah. The easiest way is to feel it, honestly. Even people who are not necessarily sensitive to these sort of things will walk into a space and they'll just say, "Ooh, this place is creepy. There's something about this."
They feel it, right?
They'll say the feng shui is off or whatever. Any number of terms. But when you go into a place and you have that feeling, then we go, something's not right about this. Just off. They're sensing that they're detecting an egregore, right? There may be nothing physically that's off about the space, but the energetic component to that space is something that they're not compatible with. Now, one person's negative egregore can be somebody else's very positive egregore.
Subjective, right?
It's subjective. It's very individual experience, which tends to create a sort of magnetism to it. So when we talk about Masonic egregores, if the egregore is strong, if it's one that's been nurtured in a particular direction, it will start to attract others, even through serendipitous circumstances, to that egregore, where situations will bring these people to that door that normally they wouldn't have been there. It could be somebody just saying, "Hey, you should check that place out, and see how that conforms."
So then it's safe to say the egregore works in mysterious ways?
Yes, but it also works in calculated ways. So egregore works in calculated ways too. In a sense, like this. So if people that are spiritual, on a spiritual path, or live on a spiritual journey in life, understand that there's powers and principalities and or angels or archangels or guardian angels guarding it. So I've never thought of that, but could it be could you actually, I know you're creating an egregore, right? And groups have egregores. Right.
But could it be the group's guardian angel in a way, or the group's higher self in a way? I don't know if anyone have ever explained egregores like that, but I'm just, I don't know.
The issue is, what if the egregore is not higher? What if it's not something that is a superior form of whatever that group is coming?
It's really a thought form of collective consciousness.
Yeah, you can create negative, non-productive egregores by work that's being. It wouldn't be a higher self. It's more a result of the type of work, and the type of, go back to a term we used earlier, a type of an ethos that's brought to the table.
Okay.
I've been in Masonic lodges, temples, both of those things, where you could just say the egregore here is just off. It's very low vibrational. It's not active. It's not alive. And when you look, you can also oftentimes see the people in the room having that same sort of sleepy, inertia-based energy about them.
Okay.
So to say that it's a guardian anything, I mean, an egregore can also very much, because it's not individualistic like that. We've been in very high vibrational egregores where it rejects those who are not either willing or able to conform to it in a very hard way. I mean, everybody comes into a space and says, I feel like I live here. It's just like a second home. I feel like I'm being embraced by this space.
Yeah.
And somebody else comes in and goes, I don't like this one bit. There's something about this. And you can just tell that there is such a divergent, energetic quality just between them and the group that's there. The egregore is conducive for the group that is habitually entering that space. But for one who is not on the same frequency, it's very non-conducive. They want to leave that space. So the egregore accepts and it rejects.